Morning to everybody. This morning, I'm going to do the 7th talk on Inmo, so there's one more left. I think it's taken almost this whole year to do this. So Inmo, remember, is a fasicle by Dogen. It means suchness or thusness or things just as they are. And the part I'm going to talk about today, I'll read to you this little paragraph in Inmo. Because he was such a person, Inmo, such a person, the 6th ancestor, who is Wei Ning, had an understanding. Subsequently, he visited Mount Huangmei and paid his respects to Chan Master Hongren, who had him lodged in the postulant's hall. So the postulant's hall would be a place if you're a layperson. Wei Ning is a layperson. After he had pounded rice day and night for some 8 months, at one point, deep in the night, Hongren himself secretly entered the pounding room and asked the 6th ancestor, so that's Wei Ning, the layman, is the rice whitened yet? The 6th ancestor said, it's whitened, but it's not yet sifted. Hongren said, Zen master struck the mortar with his staff 3 times, and the 6th ancestor sifted the rice in the winnow 3 times. It is said that at this time, the ways of the master and the disciple came together, though they themselves did not know it, and it was not understood by others. The transmission of the Dharma and the transmission of the robe was precisely at such a moment. Okay, so let me talk about, first I want to talk about Dogen's, remember last time we talked about Dogen's definition of what wisdom is. So I'll just briefly kind of review that again. So Dogen is giving an example of what he called in the previous section of Inmo, wisdom. He said, wisdom transmits to wisdom. Wisdom seeks out wisdom. Do you remember that part? Wisdom transmits to wisdom. Wisdom seeks out wisdom. So this is this little story here about how Hongren receives the robe, about Wei Ning receiving the robe from Hongren is an example of that. So just to say, it's not uncommon in Zen stories, especially like here Dogen's referring to the Wei Ning as a 6th ancestor before he was actually recognized as a 6th ancestor. So that's not an uncommon thing in these Zen stories. So you kind of have to like get straight who's who. But in this case, Wei Ning is going to become the 6th ancestor. Hongren is the 5th ancestor. And these are ancestors in the lineage chart of Zen, right? So theoretically, Bodhidharma brought Zen to China from India, and then 5 transmission lineages later, we have Hongren, who's the 5th ancestor. Bodhidharma would be the 1st, and then Hongren is and then Wei Ning is the 6th. So, but previously in this text, Dogen talks about a wisdom using the word qi. And it's not qi in the sense of energy, like we think of, when we go to acupuncture or something like that. It means awareness, understanding, or intimately knowing something. So that's what we're talking about here, is this kind of intimate knowing of something. So it's wisdom that doesn't have labels. And so it's not a kind of intellectual wisdom. And it's a wisdom that manifests in response to a situation, a skillful response to a situation. And so here Dogen's talking about this intimate knowing between the teacher and the disciple, between the Zen master Hongren and his disciple Wei Ning. So this is this non-intellectual intimacy, which is wisdom transmits to wisdom, wisdom seeks wisdom. So there's this way in which wisdom is kind of like a separate entity, although it's residing within the context of the personal or the particular, this relationship between Hongren and Wei Ning. But wisdom seeks wisdom. It's kind of like water, seeks the lowest point, or water is going to flow like that. So, all right, so Dogen said, because he was such a person, the sixth ancestor had an understanding. So what I want to say here now and talk about is the story about the sixth ancestor, which pretty famous story in Zen, but I don't think we've talked about it much here at Ocean Gate. So I'll go over the story again. If you've heard it, great. If you haven't, no problem. So the sixth ancestor lived between 638 and 713 in China. His Japanese name is Daikon Enno. So when we chant on Tuesdays, we chant the lineage, right? Daikon Enno is in that lineage as the sixth ancestor. So his story is told in a text called the Platform Sutra. And the discussion of Wei Ning's life, the Platform Sutra is a talk given by Wei Ning. So it's an autobiographical, the first part of it is an autobiographical presentation of his life, his training, his awakening, and his teachings. So that's what's in the Platform Sutra. Okay, so Wei Ning's dad was an official and he fell in hard times and he died. And so Wei Ning was supporting his mother by going out in the woods and chopping down trees and selling firewood. And one time when he was in the marketplace selling firewood, he heard a verse from the Diamond Sutra, which is one of the sutras in the collection that's called the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And we chant the Heart Sutra, which is also part of that collection of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So Wei Ning heard this couple lines, this verse, and immediately he was awakened to the need to practice. Immediately he had an insight upon this chance hearing of this. And so when this happened, the story's a little more intricate, but I want to keep it kind of simple. When this happens, he decides that he needs to go and study the Dharma. And Dogen says, because Wei Ning was such a person, this is quote, was such a person, he had an understanding. In other words, because Wei Ning already had this capacity for awakening, he had an insight about the nature of what he was hearing. So this is true for all of us, right? We are Buddha nature. We are all capable of these kinds of insights. And I would suggest that while we may not have some great epiphany that compels us to run off to the monastery, something got you here to the Zendo, something causes you to come and listen to these talks. So what is it? And from a Buddhist perspective, we would say, this is wisdom seeking wisdom. This is our innate Buddha nature awakening and being drawn to the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, in order to understand something more deeply about the nature of reality. So in the Platform Sutra, in this autobiography, Wei Ning is compelled to go to the monastery, and he goes to the monastery of Master Hongren. And when he first arrives at the monastery, Master Hongren says to Wei Ning, he says, you're a barbarian. It's like, I don't know why you're here. Wei Ning's illiterate, so he's not part of the intelligentsia or something like that. And so when he gets there, Hongren challenges him. That's not uncommon in these stories. And Wei Ning, he responds to Hongren and he says, although people from the south and people from the north differ, there is no north and south in Buddha nature. So I think it's in the Sandokai, we chant, there are no southern or northern ancestors. So Wei Ning's saying, nope, sorry, in the Buddha nature, in the Buddha Dharma, we don't have north and south. And then he says, although my barbarian's body and your body are not the same, what difference is there in our Buddha nature? So that is Wei Ning's response to Hongren. So clearly this is a pretty good response, from a Zen perspective, I'd say he kind of nailed it. So Hongren really doesn't respond to this. And so Hongren just says, okay, he understands that Wei Ning has a deep understanding, but for various reasons, he doesn't want to really acknowledge that at this point. So he just says to Wei Ning, would you go to the Pashan stall? I just want you to go and start pounding rice in the kitchen, which is the job that he was assigned. So this was because he was a layperson and he was also supposed to be illiterate. So he ends up in the kitchen pounding rice, which he did for over 8 months. Now, at the end of this time, after about this 8 months or so, Hungren decides that he's going to kind of present this little test of his monks to pick his successor. So he says, I want you to go and write on the wall, some specific wall in the monastery. I want you to go and write your understanding on this wall in verse form. And then based on what you write, I'll pick one of you as being my successor. So the head monk, he's modest guy. And at the encouragement of the rest of the monks, he decides, okay, I'll write a verse, which he does. And his verse is, and no one else wrote a verse except for Sheng Shui, which is his name. He wrote the verse. He was encouraged by his fellow monks. And his verse is, the body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a bright mirror stand. At all times, we must strive to polish it and must not let dust collect. Okay, the body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a bright mirror stand. At all times, we must strive to polish it and must not let dust collect. So Wei Ning had someone read this to him because he was curious about what this was about. And he comes up with his own verse. And so he asked someone to write this verse on the wall of the monastery next to Shen Shui's. So that happens. And his verse is, Bodhi originally has no tree. The mirror has no stand. Buddha nature is always clear and pure. Where is there room for dust? Okay, so this is pretty contradictory to what Shen Shui had said. Bodhi originally has no tree. Okay, so Shen Shui says the body is a Bodhi tree. The mirror has no stand. That's Wei Ning. Shen Shui said the mind is like a bright mirror stand. Shen Shui said at all times we must strive to polish it and must not let dust collect. And Wei Ning says the Buddha nature is always clear and pure. Where is there room for dust? So, basically, Shen Shui is saying we have to work diligently to keep the Dharma going and keep the Dharma from collecting dust or, becoming our practice becoming delusional. And Wei Ning verse, he rebuts this by saying, no, the Dharma cannot be tainted by delusion. So that's just, there are a lot of treatises and discussions about the meaning of these two verses, very famous in Zen, but that's not the point of my talk today. So I don't want to go into a whole thing about what the two verses are, but generally that's what's going on here. Okay, so Master Hongren reads the two verses and he realizes that Wei Ning is his successor. And, but, I think he probably suspected that all along. And that's one of the reasons he kind of set up this test. So it's in the middle of the night and Hongren goes to Wei Ning in the kitchen, which by the way, I think is interesting and strange in and of itself that the head teacher, the Zen master goes to the kitchen to have a chat with this guy who's illiterate, who's a layperson, who's pounding rice in the kitchen, who Wei Ning appears to be at work at midnight, which is very diligent of him. Anyway, Hongren, he goes to the kitchen to talk to Wei Ning, and he does this because he needs to do it secretly. So Dogen wrote, Hongren himself secretly entered the pounding room and asked the sixth ancestor, is the rice whitened yet? The sixth ancestor said, it's whitened, but not yet sifted. Hongren struck the mortar with his staff 3 times. So the mortar would be the vessel. I looked this up online. How do you winnow rice, pound rice? by hand. And the way that these folks were doing it is that they have this big stone, is it the mortar and the pestle, right? So the mortar is the vessel part, right? The pestle is so they have these big stone mortar that's probably about 3 feet high, maybe bigger. It's like kind of conical shaped and has a big hole, cut in it, and you can stand up with it, stick, and you pound it. So that's probably what Wei Ning was doing. So Hongren goes up and he strikes the mortar with his staff 3 times. So he goes like bang, bang, bang on the side of the mortar. And then the 6th ancestor sifted the rice in the winnow 3 times. So he has the rice with the husks separated in like a basket, and he goes like that with a basket in response to Hongren going bang, bang, bang. So we have hit, 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 right? That happens immediately after that. And then it is said, this is Dogen again, it is said that at this time, the ways of the master and disciple came together. So that process here, that's to look at what's going on here. So we're assuming that Hongren has already seen something in Wei Ning, and so he goes to him in the middle of the night to check with him. Now, so when he enters the room, he says, "Is the rice whitened yet?" So basically he's saying to the 6th ancestor, "Are you ripe yet? Have you got this teaching? Are you a Zen master essentially?" And the 6th ancestor says, "It's whitened, but it's not yet sifted." In other words, I've got the husks off, but we're not quite there yet to Hongren. So when Hongren strikes the mortar 3 times with the staff, and then Wei Ning goes in the basket, this is this intimate meeting of the minds. This is this immediate response between the master and the disciple. It's like it's a merging happening. It is wisdom seeks wisdom. At transmission, and wisdom transmits to wisdom at that point. So it's non-intellectual. If Hongren had hit the mortar 3 times and Wei Ning had not responded, then we would know that it had missed the mark. But of course, in these stories, we don't hear the story if they missed the mark. We're hearing the story because this intimate transmission happened between these 2 men at that moment. Now, when you whiten the rice, you remove the husks from the grains of rice. And so I think this is a very interesting metaphor for the student-teacher relationship. If you want to remove the husks from the rice by hand, and so you're pounding it, according to my research on YouTube, you have to be really careful when you pound the husked rice. So when you're trying to separate the husk from the rice, if you're not gentle with it, you can actually damage the rice. So if you're not gentle and aware of what the student needs, you can damage the student's relationship. You can damage their understanding of the Buddha Dharma by being too hard in some way. And so, this is what Hongren does with Wei Ning. He sees Wei Ning as soon as he comes to the monastery, and he says, to himself, this student needs to be in the kitchen pounding rice. Like, it's not going to work if I ordain him at this point and stick him in the hall with the meditating monks. So he has this insight about the nature of how he wants to relate to Wei Ning. So, so he recognizes Wei Ning, but he wants to be very careful about this. Okay, so after they have this kind of meeting of the mind, Wei Ning says, "Will you teach me further?" And they go to the abbot's room at that point, and it's midnight, midnight is the 3rd watch of when the Buddha awakened. And so Dharma transmission traditionally is done at midnight, as done in the evening. And so it's a series of ceremonies that's done between the abbot and their disciple to receive Dharma transmission. So Wei Ning goes to the abbot's room, And Hongren instructs him more about this verse from the Diamond Sutra. And then at the end of that instruction, he decides that now Wei Ning really understands what he needs to understand. And so Hongren transmits the Okesa, but usually we don't know which Okesa or what Okesa he transmitted to him. Maybe it was Bodhidharma's. In some stories, there's this way that in which the Okesa in these early stories are Okesas that belong to previous teachers. It's not now we sow an Okesa and that's the Okesa that we receive. But in some of the earlier stories, in medieval times in China, they're receiving Okesas that belong to pass down through the lineage. Anyway, he transmits the Okesa to Wei Ning, which is interesting because Wei Ning is still a layperson. And so the rest of the story goes, before I go back to talk about what Dogen had to say about this particular part of the story, the rest of the story is Wei Ning Hongren says to Wei Ning, it's not safe for you to stay here in the monastery now that I've given you Dharma transmission. And the reason it's not safe is that the monks are going to be so angry that this illiterate person who's been working in the kitchen received the robe over the head monk who they all respect and care about. So they're going to be really, feeling a lot of loyalty towards this guy. And so, I need you to leave right now in the middle of the night, leave the monastery, take the robe with you. And for the next 6 weeks, 6 years, don't teach. And after 6 years, you can teach. Okay, so Wei Ning says yes. But when the monks found out that Wei Ning had the transmission robe, 200 of them tried to follow him. And so I guess he had a pretty good head start because it was arduous and it was difficult to follow him. And finally, 199 of them decided that it was too much work. And so they all gave up except one guy. And this person's name is Wei Ming. So the reason they're called like Hongren, Wei Ning, Wei Ming, Wei Zhuan, whatever, is because teacher usually gives one of the characters of their name to the person that they're giving, a Dharma name to. So that's why a lot of these people have similar names. So, okay, so this monk named Wei Ming catches up with Wei Ning. And here's how Wei Ning tells the story in his autobiography. He said, when Wei Ming was about to overtake me. Oh, well, first of all, let me backtrack just a second here. There's more than one version of the Platform Sutra. Some scholars think that Dogen, the Platform Sutra that existed during Dogen's time that he was aware of, he didn't think actually reflected Wei Ning's teaching. So he's a little suspicious of it. And there is a version of the Platform Sutra that I have that I got back in the 60s, which is a little book, and it's got the Platform Sutra and the Diamond Sutra in it. It's a little paperback, which came from a translation that was done by a Chinese guy supposedly in the 30s. Then later on, there are these caves in China, Dongguan caves, and they find all of these Buddhist scripture, and they find a much earlier version of the Platform Sutra. And so the most famous translation of that was by a guy named Yang Polsi, who's a scholar. Anyway, so there are two versions. In the earliest version, this story that I'm about to tell you does not happen, but it happens in the later version, and it's a story that a lot of people know, and that's why I want to tell the story. So here's what Wei Ning says in this kind of alternative but very popular version of the Platform Sutra. When Wei Ming was about to overtake me, I threw the robe and begging bowl on the rock. And so I think maybe he just kind of places it on the rock, and he says, this robe is nothing but a symbol. What is the use of taking it away by force? So he says that to Wei Ming, if you want it, take it, you can have it. But when Wei Ming got to the rock and he tried to pick it up, he couldn't pick it up. It was so heavy that he couldn't pick this stuff up. So then all of a sudden he has this like huge epiphany and he shouts out, lay brother, I come for the Dharma, not for the robe. And then he says, then he throws himself on the ground and bows to Wei Ning and said, lay brother Wei Ning, preach to me, please. So that's kind of the more traditional way that we hear this story. This is very much like when after the Buddha sat, the Buddha had these 5 ascetics, guys who he hung out with, and they didn't eat, they got really skinny, they barely drank, and they were, in India wandering around together doing this practice. And, the story of the Buddha is that he's very emaciated. And this young woman brings him some milk and says, you should drink the milk, and he drinks it. And then he feels better and he goes and he sits under the Bodhi tree and he has this enlightenment experience. And then he decides to go off and he's walking down the road and he stops. And the 5, his previous buddies, if you will, in practice, see him and they say, oh, he's just completely stopped practicing. Look at him. He's been eating. He's doing all this stuff. So he doesn't know anything, right? And so they're pretty much disparaging Shakyamuni. But when they get closer and closer to Shakyamuni, they realize that Shakyamuni has had a deep understanding. And by the time they get in his presence, they've become his disciples. So in some ways, this story about Wei Ning mirrors that story about Shakyamuni Buddha. So Dogen says about this, he says, though they themselves, Wei Ning and Hongren, did not know it, and it was not understood by others, the transmission of the Dharma and the transmission of the robe was precisely at such a moment, Inmo, precisely at such a moment. So Dogen's saying the transmission didn't happen in the abbot's cabin when Hongren gave Wei Ning the robe. He's saying the transmission happened exactly at that moment of tock, tock, tock on the mortar and sift, sift, sift there. That was it. That was that moment of this deep, unspoken realization of the master-disciple relationship happened in this way. This is where wisdom seeks wisdom and where transmission of the wisdom seeks transmission of the wisdom. So that's what Dogen's saying. He's saying they didn't know that at the time, and other people don't understand this. They think it happened at this later time, but actually that is exactly when the Dharma and the transmission of the robe happened, was at that moment that he describes. So at that point, Hongren and Wei Ning, they see eye to eye. This is the state of unsurpassed awakening and the truth of the Buddha Dharma, which is what Dogen calls is wisdom. So it's the wisdom seeking out wisdom. And according to Dogen, this is the actual transmission of the Dharma. Okay, so now what about us? We have this story here. This is a very nice story about Wei Ning and Hongren. But what about us? What about our own wisdom seeking wisdom? How does that work? What is our own intellectual aspect of this? So I was thinking about, when we get together in the Zendo and we gasho together, that's wisdom seeking wisdom. It's a kind of foundational action. The rituals we engage in as a sitting zazen is a kind of foundational action of this transmission of Dharma. It's not this transmission of wisdom, if you will. It's not intellectual. Whatever we're thinking about it is not necessarily what's actually being transmitted at that moment. And I was thinking about even something like, Eileen wrote on the listserv last week. There was an author that she really likes. And so she sent us some pictures of the words of this author. So what is it about that author? What is it about Eileen? What is being transmitted from that book or that thought of that author at that moment. And so that is wisdom seeking wisdom. That is, so it's not just about coming to the Zendo, but it's any of those moments where some deeper aspect of ourselves sees and recognizes and bonds, if you will, with some deeper aspect of some other position, person, thing, that speaks to us and brings out this sense of this we innately understand this wisdom when we encounter this wisdom. But like when we read it in a book, is it the book that is the wisdom? Is it the wisdom of the person? Is that person present for us at that moment? We have non-duality of past, present, and future. So that person is present in that moment. At that moment of reading that person is present for us as we're reading it. Eileen probably doesn't know this author. I'm assuming she doesn't know her. But, it's like there is this transmission happening at that moment of wisdom seeking wisdom. So I would say that, when we are moved to do something, when we engage, we see someone suffering and our heart goes out to them and we engage in that way. When we, engage in generosity, or we hear these stories about people who are floods, all the kind of natural disasters that have been happening all over the world and in the United States, people just go out and help each other. That's wisdom seeking wisdom. They don't say, who did you vote for? So we have that level of who did you vote for? I went to an exercise class here in Santa Cruz, and this guy comes up to me and says, who did you vote for in 2016? Like, that was going to be the criteria whether or not he was going to speak to me. So it's like, I'm like, what? But the thing about it is, this is deeper than that kind of thing. This is this absolute, just reaching out when we see the need for somebody to reach out. So it's laughing together, it's singing a song together. And, it's an author bringing forward an open heart. So this is the intimacy that Dogen's talking about here when he tells a story. And he says, though they themselves did not know it, and it was not understood by others, the transmission of the dharmas and transmission of the robe was precisely at such a moment. So precisely, it was a total expression of things just as they are in that moment. And so I would suggest to you that, of course, this happens to us as well. It's not necessarily all about some kind of fancy Zen story. Thank you.